You're listening to Classic Dialogues, Land Power in the Indo-Pacific, a China Land Power Studies Center production. The views and opinions expressed in this podcast are those of the guests and are not necessarily those of the Department of the Army, the U.S. Army War College, or any other agency of the United States government. I am Colonel Rich Butler, the director of the China Land Power Studies Center, and today we're talking with Dr. Sheena Chestnut Greitens, our visiting professor of research in Indo-Pacific security with the China Land Power Studies Center. She's also an associate professor at the University of Texas at Austin, where she directs UT's Asia Policy Program. Today, we will be chatting about why we should think about the potential for a protracted war in the Indo-Pacific and what lessons we should be learning from analyzing the topic. So, Sheena, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you for having me. It's great to be on with you.
So we've got a really good set of questions, and I know you're well prepared for this discussion, having talked about it previously in other forums. We thought it was important to bring it to the podcast environment where the larger community of interest can see some of the things that you're actually researching, analyzing, and helping us educate folks on. Given what's going on in the Indo-Pacific, what type of conflict do you think we should be preparing for?
Yeah, I think that's a terrific and very, very difficult question when we look at the Indo-Pacific security landscape today. So I was watching the events at the Shangri-La Dialogue in Singapore this past week, really was reminded again that there are a wide range of potential pathways into conflict between the United States and China, each of which could potentially pull other powers in Asia in as well. We often focus on a crisis over Taiwan, but that's not the only way that the United States can find itself involved in military conflict with the PRC. For example, the United States has clarified that its Article 5 obligations under mutual defense treaties with Japan and the Philippines apply to areas where control is currently being actively contested with China or by China. The Senkaku Diaoyu Islands in the case of Japan, and the South China Sea, particularly right now, Second China Shoal with the Philippines. And this is actually despite the fact that the United States does not take a position on the sovereignty claims at stake in some of these contested areas. That gives us a couple of different geographic places where we could end up pulled into conflict. But the other issue is that either accident or deliberate escalation could lead to conflict in any one of these three places, the East China Sea, the South China Sea, or across the Taiwan Strait. And so that immediately puts us into a position where we've got a really wide range of scenarios to plan for and to think through. For example, the way that the U.S. and the Japanese self-defense forces would work together would likely be very different if the United States is supporting Japan in operations to defend the Senkaku Diaoyu Island area versus if it was asking for Japanese support and working with the SDF on a contingency with respect to Taiwan. Similarly, support for Japan versus the Philippines would look completely different given the discrepancies in the relative maritime capabilities of those two allies in the Indo-Pacific. And then the sort of third factor, which you have direct experience with, is the need for the United States to prepare for some kind of horizontal escalation from the Korean Peninsula, and therefore some kind of simultaneous operations if any of these scenarios were to escalate and somehow involve the Korean Peninsula, or if North Korea decided to take advantage of another crisis elsewhere. So the role of the Army in the opening phases, let alone in any protracted or later phases of a conflict scenario, could be really, really different if it's expected to fight major combat operations on the peninsula while also supporting the joint force in operations elsewhere in Asia. So one of the reasons why this is a really tricky question is it's really hard to say this is the type of conflict we should prepare for and plan accordingly. The range of scenarios is potentially pretty vast, and the decision chain gets pretty complex once you start thinking through the scenarios and the way they interact with each other.
No, that's fair. And thanks for sort of identifying not only what we should be preparing for, but also sort of some of the scenarios of the where and how the conflict starts and then spreads horizontally. And then obviously there's a controlling vertical escalation component to that as well that quickly rises to the nuclear side, particularly in a place like North Korea, where the stated intent of having nuclear weapons is in early use and the growing modernization of a PRC. And the challenge is not being daunted by that no, you can't go to war or defend your vital interests just because another state has nuclear capabilities, but understanding how you fight through and control that escalation is a significant challenge that goes on in there. So what do you think are some of the key internal intervening variables that Xi and the CCP are watching as they think about their decision-making calculus? Because of all the scenarios you brought up, the PRC is involved in all of them.
So I look at two big factors, and this is not an exhaustive list, but I guess I would start by thinking about two key factors that I think will shape the PRC's decision making and how they approach risk and escalation management and any number of key questions in the conflict. One is sort of where conflict might break out along the PLA's modernization curve. And the other is sort of the current status at the time of conflict initiation of the PLA's anti-corruption efforts. So on the modernization front, China's capabilities have obviously grown significantly over the course of the past decades and are on pace for that to continue. But there remain some key gaps that in the PLA's capabilities to execute some of the scenarios that you and I were just discussing. And these also interact with changing U.S. and allied and partner capabilities as certain capabilities either come online or certain arrangements with allies and partners get established or built on. That interactive dynamic around capabilities, relative capabilities is going to change. Ironically, one of the things that's helped maintain successful deterrence in the Taiwan Strait has been Beijing believing that the window to take Taiwan isn't closing yet, and that actually its chances to gain control over the island might be better in the future than if it tries now, because this is a high-risk operation. It's potentially existential for both Xi Jinping and for the CCP. So the general assumption is that given the political risks of the operation and the military difficulty of it, the CCP is going to want to be pretty confident that it'll succeed before it initiates any kind of operation to try to control Taiwan. But that leads to this really interesting political challenge of how the United States strengthens the military capabilities around deterrence while still politically convincing Beijing that its interests are best served by continuing to pursue a path of peaceful unification and sort of keeping things below the threshold of conventional military conflict. So, how the Chinese leadership perceives a closing window of opportunity if they happen to believe that they're in one, or that they get in a situation where they believe they're in one, interacting with its own beliefs about what the PLA is capable of could shape the type of operation they choose to pursue. Blockade, amphibious assault, various different scenarios. That has some pretty major implications for both the opening phase of the conflict and any potential more protracted conflict scenario. The other thing that I think is really going to matter is the status of the party's anti-corruption efforts in the PLA. This is a critical factor affecting Xi Jinping's confidence in his military commanders. And that might sound kind of vague, but if Xi Jinping lacks confidence in the PLA and believes that corruption has limited their ability to convert the resources they've been getting to actual fighting power, then he may be more reluctant to engage in the higher risk types of military operation. So, a lot feeds into that confidence. It's not clear right now whether he's purging people in the rocket forces and elsewhere in the PLA because he's worried about their operational effectiveness or because he's worried about their political loyalty, or some interactive dynamic between the two. But, how he views what's going on with those efforts, which by all accounts he pays close attention to and directs. And then, how he factors in lessons from what the PLA and what he as a leader are observing in the conflict in Ukraine, how he interprets signals from U.S. and allies and partners in Asia. All of this is going to feed into his confidence in the PLA. But I think the two things that I'm watching closely are, the actual modernization curve in terms of how that affects relative capabilities for deterrence across the strait. And then this question of anti-corruption and how we think that's affecting Xi Jinping's assessment of what the PLA can successfully pull off in what would be the highest risk, sort of one of the highest risk moves in his political career and in China's political history.
That's a fantastic explanation. Thanks for that. Because, obviously, if conflict and war erupts over a place like Taiwan, they're going to end up, that the PLA is going to end up having to do the three highest risk military maneuvers that you can do. And that's a large scale amphibious assault combined with a large scale airborne operation, combined then with a large-scale breakout operation in a very dense urban and canalized and mountainous terrain. which creates an awful lot of risk that we tend not to think about, but know that they're growing their capability. And the challenge is, how do you assess that risk, and how do you take them at their word that that's the stated political objective, therefore it's a stated military objective. Can I change the subject just a touch, because you're also an expert on Korea, North Korea in particular? How does the calculus, in your estimation, change if something goes wrong and the armistice, we go to crisis and a potential armistice break on the Korean Peninsula? How does Xi and the CCP start thinking then?
It depends on what the crisis is and, sort of, again, the level to which it escalates. I think that the CCP finds North Korea a pretty useful strategic ally and a partner in tying down both the U.S. and ROK forces to a certain extent with other security concerns in Asia. I don't think that it would probably want to get pulled into or feel obligated to intervene in Korea to the extent that it might sacrifice or require the PLA to significantly change its prioritization of Taiwan. And we know that Taiwan is the thing that Xi Jinping has tied to his overall political narrative of national rejuvenation by 2049. It's the scenario that he's told the PLA to be ready for by 2027. So I think, there are situations in which China might find a distraction useful, but not something that requires them to divert significant resources and planning, let alone operational capability to address. So that's sort of how I think they would try to manage their relationship with North Korea and the situation on the Korean Peninsula. I think they'd want to, colloquially speaking, keep their eye on the ball, and that means Taiwan.
That's a fair assessment, and very hard, and honestly, one of the reasons we're talking about protracted war, because some of the challenges is after you get through the initial phases of a war and you realize that nobody won, then everybody starts going, well, what's next? And the questions and the answers start changing. And they may even be things that, we've talked about you wouldn't consider before the war started. That's where history and understanding history plays a bit of a role in some of this stuff. How will Beijing's strategy in the opening phases of any conflict address the role of U.S. allies, partners, and reconcile potentially competing incentives related to these countries' prospective roles?
Yeah, I think the key part of your question relates to this idea of competing incentives. From Beijing's standpoint, an effort to avoid protracted conflict. So let me back up and say one of the things that we know is that the general sort of take on protracted conflict in Chinese writing, to the extent that we've been able to review and delve into it, is it's a bad idea. Here's how to avoid it. There's relatively little in detail on how to fight and win a protracted conflict. So that means, from Beijing's standpoint, an effort to avoid protracted conflict, which is their sort of stated or emphasized goal, could mean limiting horizontal escalation, meaning not bringing in U.S. allies and partners in the region, potentially globally, given NATO's growing interest in security relationships with countries and U.S. partners and allies in Asia. But there is this issue now that China's political and operational incentives may kind of cut against each other. And in a personalized decision-making system like the one Xi Jinping has created, it's actually hard to tell ahead of time which logic he's going to use to make his decision. So let me explain what I mean by that, because that probably sounds kind of vague. Politically, Beijing is likely to want to avoid internationalizing a cross-strait conflict as much as possible. I think that's one of the lessons that it's learned from watching Ukraine. My own assessment is that it's already priced in the United States coming to Taiwan's defense, but is less certain exactly what other regional and global powers would be willing to do. And so the political incentive, therefore, is going to be to try to drive a wedge between the U.S. and its other allies and partners on Taiwan's defense. And so it may gamble that if I don't attack them, if I'm Xi Jinping, and the PLA, if we don't attack allies and partners in Asia, and if possible, we maybe even pull our punches on attacking U.S. forces or bases stationed on those allies and partners' territory. And they could also message then something like, this isn't your fight, keep yourselves safe, contribute to stability by not intervening. We saw a little bit of this messaging with the comment about being hitched to the U.S. war chariot this past couple of weeks from the Chinese side, right? And that also allows Beijing, that approach of trying to drive a wedge between the U.S. and allies and partners on involvement in operations, for example, over Taiwan, also allows Beijing to potentially use some of its information operations capabilities to play on the domestic political incentives in different allied capitals, to activate domestic debates, that might be critical for a democracy, right, and a democratic public's decision to support involvement in war, but could slow down decision-making in ways that are decisive to the opening phases of a conflict, particularly if China's strategy is to try to end it quickly. Operationally, so that's the, right, like keep U.S. allies and partners out, avoid horizontal escalation is kind of, seems to be the political incentive. Operationally, though, the PLA's incentives may be pretty different. And they may be tempted to try to remove certain assets from the table in the region by striking first, whether that's U.S. forces in Guam, southern Japan, and the Philippines, elsewhere in the Indo-Pacific. And given the co-location of some of these bases and assets with civilian populations and infrastructure, a Chinese preemptive strike on those assets might be militarily advantageous, but risks bringing whatever country is hit immediately into the fight on self-defense ground, with implications that may actually increase in time, right, as forces are able to flow across the Pacific into what could be a protracted conflict. So I think that it's actually pretty uncertain, at least in the sort of open source space, how exactly China is going to reconcile those competing incentives. And frankly, in a, the more and more the system gets centralized under Xi Jinping as the chairman of the Central Military Commission, the harder it may be to predict in advance how he's going to make these decisions, because then you're in the realm of psychology, not political or military analysis.
No, that's fair. And actually, you just gave a great statement for some of the reasons why we established the China Landpower Study Center and things you have to actually think about. The beginning with the cognitive shift of what might happen with a protracted war and what are the options and what's the PLA capable of doing and how's that decision-making calculus work from the military leadership into the CMC and then beyond the CMC into places like the Politburo. And fascinating insight from some of the work that you're doing here, which we're obviously greatly appreciative of, but also sharing it with the community of interest, because there are no easy answers, but we're trying to find the right deterrence balance to make sure you don't go to war. These are the types of research and analysis and discussions we need to sort of have. Let me shift a little bit to it, perhaps an even harder question. How will the U.S. and Chinese publics and their economies, including but not limited to the defense industrial base, handle a conflict that does not achieve rapid, decisive results for either side?
Yeah, also a tricky question. So I think this is an important one to think through because, there's a lot of discussion of the possibility of a PLA amphibious assault on Taiwan. Recently, we've seen some pieces. I'm thinking about, some work by Dan Blumenthal and Fred Kagan and the Coalition Defense of Taiwan Project, or the piece by Isaac Carden and Jennifer Kavanaugh in Foreign Affairs recently about some of the lower level scenarios that the PLA could use and PRC could use that are still coercive, but designed to achieve more incremental control over Taiwan. Even if you're discussing the scenario of a possible amphibious assault, very few analysts who study the Chinese political system and the Chinese military think that if the initial effort at an assault fails, that Xi Jinping would just shrug and go home. At that point, too much is on the line for the regime's survival and security of Xi Jinping and the CCP. One of the only concrete deliverables, like I mentioned earlier, that Xi Jinping had tied to the objective of national rejuvenation. And, failure could pose an existential crisis for Xi and the CCP. So then the question is, okay, if an amphibious assault is unsuccessful or only partially successful, maybe a blockade becomes the likely sort of fallback. And, if you look at writings and things like that, the PLA's Science of Campaigns, it describes a joint blockade in terms of a large-scale, long-term operation, maybe combined with efforts to establish air control, sea control, information control. But a blockade alone is not a war-winning or a war termination strategy. So there's still this question of, okay, politically, how do you bring a conflict to an end? And so I think this is an important point because we often talk about protracted conflict without necessarily thinking of it as a bunch of different types of conflict strung together over time. And the reality is that the opening phase could be a very different type of conflict than a protracted scenario. And so we need to be prepared for the type of conflict embedded in this concept of protraction to change more than one. Two other things to kind of think about. One is, the further you get into a conflict, the more, right, both sides are going to be updating their sense of what's possible and how to bring the war to a conclusion, or all parties in the conflict probably going to be a multi-party no matter what, it's hard to see this not being a multi-party conflict, right? All of the parties involved are going to be updating information based on how the conflict plays out to try to figure out what is possible in terms of achieving our objectives, and is there eventually a bargaining space that where you could find an end to the conflict. The issue is that, especially in a system like China's, the information that Xi Jinping and the PLA may get may not match the information that is available or accessible to the other parties in the conflict. And so that over time, that could actually make it harder to reach a bargaining space or a place where you could end the conflict, not easier. And then the other thing, which you alluded to earlier, but I just wanted to really highlight, is that depending on how the initial phases of a conflict go, that could dramatically alter the risks of nuclear escalation. And I don't know how much public pressure will come to bear versus just the sort of logics of nuclear escalation and deterrence. But if either the US or China faces catastrophic risks and high casualties to regain losses that they incur or suffer in the opening phase, then discussions of nuclear weapons on one or both sides could shift dramatically and become much more plausible than they are now. If the conflict becomes protracted, thinking through the risks of nuclear escalation is really, really an important question. Just to circle back, all of this feeds into the broader question you raised, which is how popular reaction, including casualty sensitivity and economic costs, the ability to tolerate the monumental economic costs of a conflict, are going to have a lot to do with each side's relative ability to sustain a potential fight over time and the will to either find a political settlement or to continue the fight. And so that'll really shape what the potential political terms of an end to this hypothetical conflict both sides might consider acceptable. Additional point on this, again, as it relates to conversations about Taiwan, I think there's been a lot more discussion of this recently, but Taiwan's ability to sustain itself politically, economically, militarily, will be potentially critical in the course of any protracted conflict. And that's a really, really difficult challenge, especially given where Taiwan's defenses are today.
From the standpoint of the overall research effort we're trying to build here, as we build the staff and the research agenda, these are not easy questions. In fact, they're downright intimidating, and that they're questions of national policy, they're questions of strategy, they're question of force design for a protracted war. They're things that we just haven't thought or talked about since, some combination of Cold War I against the Soviets and pre-World War I global integration 1.0, which we're grappling with in terms of how political and military and economic things tie together in completely different ways in the burgeoning nuclear era, if you will. One follow-up question, because you've also done a boatload of research on Belt Road Initiative, the Global Civilization Initiative, Global Development Initiative, Global Security Initiatives. How do you see that use in terms of how the CCP thinks about resiliency and conflict versus just doing global good?
First, China is a mobilizational political system. This is something that Leninist political systems do. They figure out a particular political objective and mobilize society to achieve it. And that has a lot of strengths and weaknesses. Again, probably too complicated to get into today. There are mobilizational sinews basically built into China's relationship with its defense industrial base that are really important, that the Chinese party state is actively working on strengthening today, and that I think will potentially come to bear in any conflict scenario. And you're right, these questions about how the U.S. mobilizes or utilizes and builds up its own defense industrial base are really questions that go above the level of the Army. There are things the Army can and can't do with respect to defense industrial mobilization. But a lot of these are really grand strategic questions that are going to have to be answered by Congress in the form of appropriations and authorizations, and by the president ultimately as the person who sets American grand strategy. And they're really hard problems to solve. So I think we're only at the very beginning of some of those conversations. I think as it relates to GSI and the Global Security Initiative and some of what China is doing, I see those largely as strategic narratives that have two purposes. One is They provide an overarching explanation and an attempt to portray China as having an alternate view or an alternate approach to achieving global security that is more beneficial to the world than the US-led alliance and partnership network. This builds on ideas China has put forth for a long time that the US alliance and partnership network is destabilizing and zero-sum because it pursues security for some people in the network at the expense of everybody else. And that's why you see, this consistent through line of, NATO is to blame for the conflict in Ukraine, et cetera, and similar attempts to sort of link that to or blame the US alliance and partnership system in Asia for tensions in the region, which I don't think have been all that successful. But it is an effort to create this sort of strategic narrative that China has an approach to global security that provides some solutions that the United States doesn't. That's mostly likely, I think, to get traction in the developing world and the global south, where there are some countries that don't find their needs in terms of security all that well served by high-end conventional defense cooperation. And they really need more basic building up rule of law, public safety, often police capacity. And there China is willing and able to supply resources that sometimes they're the only provider of. And so I think that it would be in the US and the interests of its allies and partners to put forward a stronger, credible alternative on those things, just to make it clear that there is a good one that countries that are interested can pursue, and that they can pursue security by that pathway, not just via GSI. But honestly, I think that, GSI is designed to promote the idea that a more coherent alternative to the United States-led security order exists than is actually provided by GSI. A lot of the work that is sort of attributed to GSI is actually done in very specific bilateral diplomacy or sometimes regional efforts. And in that case, China's really able to use the advantage of bilateralism, where it's the stronger party in almost any one of these relationships. As it relates to potential conflict or the applicability of something like GSI, I don't think you're going to see a lot of combat capability coming to bear on the side of China. These aren't formal military alliances. That's not what GSI is doing. It's much more, I think, about building an alternative security order around law enforcement capability and non-traditional security, but again, also to promote this strategic narrative that delegitimates the U.S. approach to security, and that is going to make it harder diplomatically, maybe, to marshal support in the event of a conflict over Taiwan. So I think it's more about strategic narratives and effort at delegitimation, as well as the building this alternative framework that suits different security interests, less about sort of a direct challenge to the United States military in Asia.
We've covered a lot of ground here. We've talked about risk escalation management, simultaneity, horizontal and vertical escalation problems. We talked about multi-parties. We've talked about how their external economic system works to draw in additional support a little bit from the economic warfare perspective, perhaps. So one more really hard question. Again, this goes back to, a little bit of the inside of the mind of the leadership, but how much planning will Beijing have done for the type of conflict that ends up unfolding?
You're getting all the hard questions in today. First, so I think it's important to remember that the problem the United States has in terms of planning for conflict cuts both ways, right? And so you said almost all of these scenarios, if not all the ones I outlined in my short list, involve the People's Republic of China, which means that, just as the United States has to plan for a wide range of scenarios, and frankly has to think about the fact that over the course of its history, the conflicts we've ended up fighting are different than the ones we often anticipated ahead of the conflict breaking out, right? But that's also true of Beijing. It has to plan for a wide range of scenarios, and it may find itself in a conflict that isn't exactly what it envisioned. And therefore, it may not be able to achieve the quick, decisive victory that current publications suggest that the Chinese would seek in any potential conflict scenario. So, honestly, Chinese, judging again solely from the open source literature, China's planning for different conflict scenarios seems somewhat uneven. There's more attention paid to some than others, and that may not be a good match for the scenario China finds itself in, and therefore that's likely to have a huge effect, right? How much planning it has done is likely to really shape China's chance of achieving its own strategic objectives. So, that may not be a very satisfying answer, but but I think the planning has been largely uneven, and it'll be interesting to see again if we get more information about that in the coming years.
Yeah, it'd be nice to see where that type of research effort sort of goes. And in my relatively simplistic mind, whether they are planning for a protracted war or not planning for a protracted war tells us something. Simply put, if they are planning for a protracted war, then we may be a little behind the power curve, shooting behind the duck, if you will. And if they aren't planning for a protracted war, then we probably have a different way of thinking about things that hey, you're not going to win easily. You can't learn the lessons of America's previous wars the last 30 years and apply them to a peer on peer hegemonic fight. So I think there's something you learn either way. But the important part is, asking the right questions and then diving into it as best we can. With that, thanks for all the help, support here as a visiting professor. It's always been a pleasure to work with you, and looking forward to the future and the agenda that we're carrying forward here at the Classic. But let me give the last word to you before I do closing comments.
Sure. I think these are all really important questions, and it is really critical to understand for the United States' own national security and international peace and security in the Indo-Pacific and globally. It's really important to understand the state of Chinese thinking and planning about all of these questions. Why I'm excited about the research that the whole team at Classic is doing, and just grateful for the chance to get to be a part of it and contribute a small piece to what the center's doing. So look forward to seeing how that unfolds in the next few years. But again, thanks for having me. Great discussion, and look forward to finding out more from the team.
Absolutely. Thank you, Sheena. For listeners, you can learn more about the China Land Power Study Center at ssi.army.warcollege.edu/classic, CLSC, the way we abbreviate the China Land Power Study Center. For more War College podcasts, check out Conversations on Strategy, Decisive Point, SSI Live, and A Better Peace.